The morning after they buried Nils Halvorsen, his widow hauled her wheat to town. Cora sat the wagon straight-backed. She watched Harlan Voss set the poise on his big platform beam. She had weighed that same load at home. Her own cart said different. The elevator beam read her a full wagon-light. She did not argue. She took the pencil he handed her. She signed the ticket, and her hand did not shake, and that was the worst part. Next haul, worse, shorted deeper. Voss turned to a yard of waiting men, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he owns the only door. "Scale don't lie," he said, "and neither do I. Take my figure or haul it home to feed the crows." 11 wagons stood in that line. 11, not one man spoke. That night she took his sealed brass pound weight down off the mantel. She drove 22 miles in the dark to the certified rail scale at Kettle Junction. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment the county you're farming or watching from. I want to see how far this weighs out. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, and let me do it slow, because a thing like this doesn't start with a scale, it starts with a marriage. Ostrander sat on the flat of Griggs County, North Dakota, where the sky takes up 9/10 of everything and the land keeps the rest. In 1933, the wheat came off the field at 41 cents a bushel. 41 cents. A man could grow it and cut it and thresh it and haul it and still owe the year money for the privilege. The drought had come in and sat down like a guest who would not leave. Every yield thinned. Every well dropped. The topsoil lifted off the west quarters in the afternoons and hung in the air like brown smoke, and folks learned to eat with a cloth over the bread. Cora and Nils Halvorsen had built their quarter section out on the Ostrander Road with their own 4 hands. 30 years of it. They came out with a borrowed team and a tar paper shanty, and they put down a house one board at a time. She could still point to the corner where the first stove stood. She could tell you which window Nils cut too small and swore he'd fix, and never did. It let in a bad draft every January of their marriage, and every January he said, "Come spring." 30 springs. The window stayed. He died in June. A bad heart, the doctor said, though the doctor came 2 days late and mostly to be paid. Nils was pulling a calf when it took him. He sat down in the straw like a man who'd remembered something, and he did not get up. He was 54 years old. Cora was 51. They had no children living. They had a milk cow, 9 hogs, a team called Duke and Molly, and 160 acres of ground that answered to no one now but her. 6 weeks she'd been a widow the morning this story turns. 6 weeks. And she still set his coffee cup out. She did it without thinking. That was the thing about grief nobody told you. It lived in your hands before it lived in your head. Every morning she filled the pot, and every morning she took down 2 cups from the shelf by the window, the white one and the blue one with the chip, and she set the blue one at his place across the oilcloth. Then she'd catch herself. She'd stand there a moment with her thumb on the chipped rim. Then she'd put it back, quiet, like she was sorry to have troubled it. And she'd drink her coffee alone and look at the field. She kept the farm running because she had promised. Not Nils. The bank. Farmers and merchants over in Cooperstown held a note on the Halvorsen quarter. There was an installment due, $186.50, and it had to be in their hands by first frost. November 1st, the paper said. Miss the frost and they could call the whole note. Call the whole note, and she lost the ground her husband was buried looking at, because they'd put him in the little rise on the northeast corner where you could see the whole place, and she was not going to let a bank plow him under. So she would make the $186.50. She had done the arithmetic 100 times at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil. The wheat would make it. Just if the wheat weighed true. That was the whole of her plan. Sell the wheat. Pay the note. Keep the ground. Keep him. Now, on the mantel in the front room, next to the clock that Nils wound every Sunday and that she now wound every Sunday, there sat a small brass weight. It was a pound weight, the kind you'd set on a balance pan. It had a little knob on the top to lift it by, and it was worn gold smooth on that knob from handling. Stamped into the flat of it was a year, 1921, and beside the year, pressed deep, was the state seal of the sealer of weights and measures. Nils had kept that weight the whole of their marriage. He never trusted another man's iron. That was his line. He'd say it flat, the way he said most things. I don't trust another man's iron. Once a year he'd carry that little brass pound down to the elevator in his coat pocket, and he'd ask Harlan Voss, right out loud, to let him check the beam against it. And Voss had to let him. Because the law said a patron could ask. And Nils Halvorsen was a man who knew exactly what the law said. He'd set his pound on the pan and read the beam and nod. Or not nod. And either way, Voss hated him for it. Voss hated any man who checked. But he'd never once caught Voss short. In all those years, and Cora had come to think the little brass weight was just a thing her husband did, like winding the clock. A habit. A stubbornness. Not a weapon. She was wrong about that. But she didn't know it yet, and neither did Voss, and that's the part I want you to hold on to. She dusted it that week with the rest of the mantle, and she thought only that was his. And she set it back down and turned away, and if you'd told her that little brass pound was going to bring a grown man to his knees in front of 30 families, she'd have looked at you like you'd had too much sun. The wheat came ripe in August. Ivar's son came over to help her cut it. Ivar was 22, a big soft-spoken boy from the next section who'd worked as Nils's hired hand 3 summers running. The Halvorsens had been good to him when his own folks had nothing, had fed him at their table, and paid him honest when other men paid boys in promises. Ivar didn't forget a kindness. He showed up the first morning of harvest with his own team hitched, said nothing about it, and went to work. He wouldn't take money. She tried. He said, Nils would have come for me, that was all. So they cut it together, the widow and the boy, and they shocked it and let it dry, and they threshed it with the neighbor's rig going round the sections, and when it was done, Cora Halvorsen had her wheat in the wagon and a farm to save. She weighed the first load at home before she took it in. She had a weight cart in the shed, a platform on wheels with a beam of its own, the kind a careful farmer keeps so he knows what he's got before another man tells him. Nils had checked that cart against his brass pound every year too. She ran the load across it slow. She wrote the figure on the inside of the shed door in pencil, the way he always had. Under 30 years of other figures climbing up the boards. Then she drove to town. Harlan Voss ran the elevator on the rail spur at the edge of Ostrander, and Harlan Voss was the only man in the county who bought grain. Understand that. There was no other buyer. The nearest elevator that wasn't his was 40 miles off over roads that ate a wagon, and 40 miles there and back with a load was 2 days and a team you might ruin. So a farmer sold to Voss. Every farmer. He knew it, and he wore it the way a small man wears a big office, which is to say too tight and too proud. He was a heavy, pink, pleasant-seeming man who kept his thumbs in his vest and called everybody friend. And there was something under the pleasant that made you not want to turn your back to it. She pulled onto the platform scale. Voss set the poise. He squinted at the beam, licked his pencil, and called the figure. It was 1.5 bushels under her home cart. She sat there a moment. 1.5 bushels. At 41 cents, that was money, but it was small money. Small enough to doubt yourself over. And she did doubt herself. That's what I want you to feel, because it's the whole trick of it. She thought, I'm tired. She thought, I've been burying a husband and running a farm and I likely miscounted the sacks. She thought, grief makes you sloppy. Every reason she reached for pointed back at her own hand, never his beam. So she signed. She took his money. She drove home. And at home she went to the shed and she counted the sacks again. And she ran the numbers on the shed door again. And the numbers on the shed door were right. She had not miscounted. But by then the wheat was his and the ticket was signed, and what was she going to do? Drive back and tell Harlan Voss his scale was wrong on 1.5 bushels? A widow, 6 weeks in? She could hear how it would sound. She put the pencil down and she let it go. That was offense 1. Small, private, swallowed, the second load, Ivar rode along. He came the morning she was hitching and said he'd ride in with her, no reason given, and she was glad of the company on the seat. They didn't talk much. Ivar wasn't a talking sort, and neither was she anymore. But when they got to the platform and Voss set his poise and called the figure, Ivar's son did a thing that changed everything. And he did it without meaning to start a war. He just read the ticket out loud. He'd carried her home cart figure in his shirt pocket on a scrap of paper, because she'd asked him to remember it. Because after the first load she'd started to wonder in the back of her mind where she didn't like to look. And now he stood there with Voss's elevator ticket in one hand and her home figure in the other, and he read them both, plain in that soft big voice. And the gap between them was worse than the first time. Not 1.5 bushels. More, the load had come up short again, and shorter. Voss looked at the boy. Something moved behind the pink, pleasant face. Then he laughed, easy, and he said, "Roads out your way are rough, son. Maybe the haul shook it loose. Grain settles." And he put his thumbs back in his vest. Grain settles. Cora almost nodded. It was the kind of thing that sounded like it could be true if you didn't know better. But Ivar was young, and Ivar had no 30 years of learning to keep his mouth shut, and Ivar folded that elevator ticket in half and put it in his shirt pocket, careful, buttoned the flap over it, and he didn't say anything at all. He kept it. That was the thing. He kept the paper. On the drive home, he finally spoke. "Ma'am," he said, "that ain't the road." "No," she said. She looked at the ditch going by. "No, it isn't. That's twice. I know it's twice. You want me to say something to him?" "And say what?" she said, not unkind. "That we counted. He'll say we counted wrong. He's got the beam and the seal and the only door in the county, Ivar. We've got a scrap of paper and a shed door." She was quiet a while. "Keep it, though," she said. "The ticket. Keep them all. I don't know why. Keep them." He kept them. Offense 2. 1 witness now, and 1 boy who didn't forget. The third time, the whole county saw. It was a Saturday, the big buying day, when every farmer with a load came to town at once, because it was the day the rail cars sat on the spur to be filled. The yard was full, wagons backed up along the road waiting their turn at the platform. Teams stamping, men leaning on their wheels in the heat with their hats pushed back, talking low the way men talk when there's money and worry in the same air. Cora counted them later without meaning to, the way you count a thing that mattered. 11 wagons in the line, 11 families waiting. Her turn came. She pulled up. Voss set the poise. And this time she had decided, somewhere on the road in, that she would ask. Not accuse. Just ask. It was her right, and she knew it was her right, because Nils had told her 100 times what her rights were on that platform. So when Voss called the figure, short again, short a third time, in front of God and 11 wagons, Cora Halvorsen said, "Quiet, not loud, not shrill. The way you'd ask a man to pass the salt, Mr. Voss. I'd like a reweigh, please." The yard went still. Not all at once. It went still in a spreading way, the talk dropping off wagon by wagon down the line as men realized something was happening on the platform. A reweigh. The widow asked for a reweigh, heads turned, and Harlan Voss, who understood better than anyone alive in that yard exactly how much his power depended on no one ever doing what this woman had just done. Harlan Voss decided to end it in front of all of them, so that it would never happen again. He didn't reweigh. He put both thumbs in his vest. He looked at her, and then he looked past her, slow, up the whole line of watching men so they'd all know he was talking to them too. And he said it loud enough to carry to the last wagon. "Scale don't lie," he said, "and neither do I. Take my figure, or haul it home to feed the crows. That was the sentence. That was the whole of him in 10 words. Take my figure, or feed the crows. There is no other buyer, widow, and we both know it, and everyone watching knows it. So sign the paper or take your wheat back down that road and watch it rot, because the crows eat free and the bank does not. Nobody spoke. That's the part. 11 wagons. 11 men who knew her, who'd known Nils, who'd sat in the same church and stood at the same graveside 6 weeks back, and not one of them said a word. Not because they were cruel. Understand that too, because it matters for later. They were afraid. Every man in that line had a note at the bank and a family at home and one buyer in the county. And if Voss would say that to a widow in the open, in front of everybody, then Voss would surely close his book to any man who took her side. So they looked at their boots. They looked at their teams. A couple of them looked at her, quick, and looked away, and that quick shamed look was almost worse than the boots. Cora sat on the wagon seat with the whole yard watching. And here is where you'd want her to shout. Here is where in the story you tell yourself she stands up and lets him have it. She didn't. She'd told you her own blind spot without knowing it. A widow's word won't move a beam. She believed that. In that moment she believed it all the way to the ground. So she took the pencil. And she signed. And she clucked to Duke and Molly, and she drove off the platform and down the road. Past the 11 wagons, past every lowered face, out of town, and she did not cry until the last house was behind her, and then she cried the way you cry when you're alone and have earned it and hate that you've earned it. That was offense 3. Public, counted, the bottom of the whole thing. But here's what Harlan Voss didn't know, sitting up there so pleased with his 10 words. He'd done his arithmetic on the wrong woman. He thought he'd shown a widow her place. What he'd actually done was 3 things he'd regret. He'd shorted her in front of 11 witnesses who would every one of them remember it when the wind changed. He'd said a sentence so ugly it would get repeated at supper tables for 6 years. And he'd taken, across those 3 loads, the exact pounds of wheat that stood between Cora Halvorsen and $186.50. Because that's what she figured, at the kitchen table, that night, with the stub of pencil. She laid it all out. The home cart figures off the shed door. The 3 elevator tickets. The 41 cents a bushel. She did the sum the way she'd done it 100 times, only now she did it with the short weights, the real ones he'd paid her, and the number at the bottom came up under. Not by much. That was the cruelty of it. Not by much. She came up short of the $186.50 by just about exactly what those 3 beams had eaten. If the wheat had weighed true, her home cart true, the true she could prove on the shed door in 30 years of penciled figures, she'd have made the note with a little to spare. Weighed the way Voss weighed it, she'd miss it. She'd miss the frost. She'd lose the ground. She'd lose the rise on the northeast corner where they'd put her husband down looking at his own fields. She sat with that a long time. The lamp burned low. Outside a dog barked once and quit. And somewhere in that long sitting, the grief in her turned over and became something with a harder edge. It didn't leave, it just changed shape. She stopped being a woman who'd been robbed and couldn't prove it. She started being a woman who was going to prove it. She thought about Nils saying, flat, "I don't trust another man's iron." She thought about how he checked Voss honest once a year with a little brass pound, and how Voss hated him for it. And how Voss had waited, hadn't he? Waited till the man who checked was 6 weeks in the ground before he set that poise a hair light. He'd waited for the checker to die. He'd looked at the widow and seen a woman who wouldn't check. She got up from the table. She went into the front room. She stood in front of the mantel a moment in the low light, and then she reached up and she took down the little brass pound weight, 1921, the state seal pressed deep in the flat of it, worn gold smooth on the lifting knob from 30 years of her husband's hand. "All right," she said to the empty room. To him, maybe, all right. It was full dark and it was 22 miles to Kettle Junction, and she woke Ivar Sund out of his folks' house at 10 at night to drive her. She could have gone in daylight. She went in the dark on purpose, and if you've ever done a thing you were afraid to be seen doing, you know why. At Kettle Junction there was a certified rail scale, a big one the railroad used. Sealed and tested and beyond any argument. And it would weigh a wagon and a team and tell you the God's truth to the pound. She didn't take a fresh load. She took the last of the wheat she hadn't sold yet, a partial, enough to prove the thing, and she took her home weight cart figure for that same partial written on a paper. And she took the brass pound in her coat pocket the way Nils used to carry it. Ivar drove. The road was bad, and the night was black, and neither of them said much. Once he asked her, "Lo, what are we doing, ma'am?" And she said, "We're finding out if I'm crazy." And he said, "You ain't crazy." And she said, "Then we're getting the proof that I'm not." And that was the whole conversation for 22 miles. The Kettle Junction scaleman was an old railroad fellow half asleep in a lamplit shack, and he was surly about the hour until he saw it was a woman and a boy and something serious in the woman's face, and then he wasn't surly anymore. He ran her partial across the certified rail scale. Slow, careful, he read it off. Then, because she asked him to, he set her little brass pound on the test pan of his own beam and checked his scale honest right there in front of her so she'd know the rail scale itself was true, and it was, dead true, the sealed weight and the certified beam agreeing to the ounce. And then she laid her home cart figure next to the rail figure. They matched. Her shed door was right. Her home cart was right. Her wheat weighed exactly what 30 years of penciled figures said it weighed. The rail scale, certified, sealed, beyond argument, agreed with the widow down to the pound. Which meant there was only one scale in the whole business that lied, and it wasn't hers. Ivar looked at the two matching figures under the lamp, and then he looked at her. And the boy's face went slowly from confusion to something older and colder. Because he was doing the same arithmetic she'd done at the kitchen table, only now it wasn't a suspicion, it was a proved and printed fact on the railroad's own paper. "He's stealing," Ivar said. Just the two words. "He's stealing." "Yes," Cora said. "He is." She had it now. She had a certified rail ticket and a home figure that matched it, and a signed elevator ticket that didn't. And any fool laying the three side by side could see the theft with his own eyes. She had, in her coat pocket and on that lamplit counter, the truth. And you'd think that would be the end of it. Take it to the sheriff, take it to the law, done. But she didn't do that. Not first. And what she did instead is the part I most want you to sit with, because it's the part that tells you exactly what kind of woman we're dealing with. Because Cora Halvorsen had been raised and had married and had lived 30 years among people who believed you gave a man his chance to make it right before you brought the roof down on him. It was almost the only thing she had left of how the world was supposed to work. So before she went to any law, she went to Harlan Voss himself, in daylight, with the boy as witness, to warn him. She drove into the elevator yard 2 days later with Ivar beside her and the tickets in her hand, and she walked up onto that same platform, and she laid the 3 papers on the counter in front of Voss, and she said it plain. Not loud. She never was loud. She said his scale was wrong. She said here was the certified rail figure, and here was her home figure, and they matched each other, and neither one matched his. She said she didn't want trouble, and she didn't want the law if it could be helped. She said, "Have your beam sealed, Mr. Voss. Have the county come test it. Make it right, and pay back what's been short, and this goes no further." She gave him the chance. That is documented. There was a witness and a date. Remember that, because it's going to matter more than any single thing in this story. She warned him, in the open, with proof, and gave him the honest way out. Harlan Voss looked down at the 3 papers on his counter. He looked at the rail ticket. He was not a stupid man, and I think for just 1 second he understood exactly what he was looking at, and exactly how much danger it held. And then he made the choice that ruined him. Because arrogance always makes the same choice. He laughed. He pushed the papers back across the counter at her with 2 fingers, like they were something spilled. "A widow's arithmetic," he said, "doesn't move a beam." And he said it loud enough for the men in the yard to hear, and he said it smiling. "You've had a hard summer, Cora. Grief muddles a person. You go on home now." And he turned his back on her. He turned his back and picked up his tally book and pretended to read it, which is a thing a man does to tell you you've stopped existing. Ivar took half a step, and Cora put her hand on his arm. She gathered up her 3 papers off the counter, slow, unhurried, and she squared them into a stack and she put them inside her coat next to the brass pound. She didn't argue. She'd learned that much from 30 years married to a quiet man. You don't argue with a turned back. You just remember it. "All right, Mr. Voss," she said, to the back of him. "I did ask you first. You remember that I asked you first." He didn't turn around. But something in the set of his shoulders, she'd swear on it later, something in his shoulders hurt her. They drove home. And on the seat of the wagon, with the fields going by brown and thin under the bad sky, Cora Halvorsen did the last piece of turning. Because a woman alone with a certified ticket is still a woman alone. Voss had counted on exactly that from the start, that every one she'd have to face him, she'd face him by herself. A lone widow against the only door in the county, and alone anything can always be waited out, or laughed off, or starved out. He'd built his whole game on people being alone. The widow alone. The old man alone. The man with 1 buyer and no second choice, alone, so she was going to stop being alone. That was the whole of what she understood on that wagon seat. She couldn't outshout him and she couldn't outweight him, and 1 certified ticket wasn't enough, because he'd just say she'd faked it or bought it or muddled it in her grief. But he could not say that about the whole county. He could laugh off a widow's arithmetic. He could not laugh off everybody's. The Grange met that Thursday. The Ostrander Grange was the farmer's hall, a plain white board building out on the section line where the members met to talk crops and prices and to complain, mostly in the safe company of men who owed the same bank and feared the same weather. Emmett Pruitt was the Grange master, a careful man in his 60s who'd held the place together for years by the simple method of never ever provoking anyone who could hurt them, and the biggest thing that could hurt them all was Harlan Voss, so the one subject the Ostrander Grange had learned never to raise in all its careful years was the elevator. Cora Halvorsen had been to maybe 4 Grange meetings in her life. It was Nils who went. But she hitched the team Thursday evening and she drove out to the White Hall on the section line. And she walked in during the price talk with her 3 papers in her hand. And the room went quiet the way rooms do when a widow walks in somewhere she doesn't usually go. Emmett stopped mid-sentence. The men turned in their chairs. She didn't make a speech. She wasn't built for speeches. She walked to the front table where Emmett had his little gavel and his ledger, and she set down her 3 papers, side by side, so the lamplight fell on them. The rail ticket, the home figure, the signed elevator ticket. And she stood there a second while they craned to see, and then she said the thing she'd come to say. And she said it looking not at Emmett but at the whole room of them, every man who'd sat silent in his wagon that Saturday. "I'm not here for me," she said. "I've got my proof. What I'm asking is, bring your own. Bring your weight carts. Bring your old elevator tickets, the ones you kept if you kept them. Lay your true figure next to what Voss paid you." She let that sit. "I'm not asking you to fight my fight. I'm asking you to count your own losses. Just count them. That's all. Go home and count what that beam's taken from your own table these 6 years, and then you tell me I'm a grief-muddled widow." And she picked up her papers, and she nodded to Emmett Pruitt, polite as church, and she walked back out into the dark and drove home. And she left that whole room of careful, frightened, indebted men sitting in the lamplight with a question on the table that not one of them had ever, in all their careful years, allowed himself to ask out loud. "What has that beam taken from me?" Emmett Pruitt sat looking at the door she'd gone out of for a long moment. Then he looked down at his own hands. and an old farmer named Tollef Bright, down at the end, cleared his throat in the quiet and said, to nobody, in a voice like a man surprised at himself, I kept mine. My tickets. I got a year of 'em in a coffee can on the shelf. And another man said, slow, I got mine too. And the room did not vote that night. It didn't decide anything. It just sat there, in the lamplight, with the question finally out loud in the middle of the floor where no one could pretend not to see it anymore, and outside, 12 miles off, in the dark, Harlan Voss was oiling his beam and sleeping fine. And he had no idea, none at all, that a widow had just walked into a white-board hall and lit the fuse on 6 years of his arithmetic. Because they were going to go home. And they were going to count. And what they were about to find in those coffee cans was going to be worse than anyone in that room, even Cora, had yet let herself imagine. They went home. And they counted. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing you have to understand about frightened men. They don't move like a river. They move like frost, one crystal at a time, in the dark, where nobody can see them change their mind. Tollef Bright was first because he'd already said it out loud, and a man who's confessed can't easily unconfess. He went home that Thursday night, and he took the coffee can down off the shelf. A year of tickets in it, curled and thumb-worn, each one Voss's own hand. And Tollef had something most of them didn't. He had a weight cart in his own granary, an old platform thing his father set true 40 years back, and he'd weighed a good many of those loads himself before he ever hauled them in. So he sat at his kitchen table with a stub of pencil, and he did the arithmetic he'd spent 6 years not doing. Load by load. His figure. Then Voss's figure. Then the gap. And the gap was always there, never the same size, never so big any one ticket would make a man holler. 2 bushels here, a bushel and a quarter there. Once, on a heavy fall haul, near 4. Little bites. The kind of loss a man blames on the road, on a wet tarp, on his own tired counting at the end of a long day. But laid end to end, a year of little bites is a wound. Tollef added it up 3 times because he couldn't believe it the first 2. Then he sat there in the cold kitchen with the lamp guttering, and he said a word his wife hadn't heard him say since the hail took the whole crop in 27. By Sunday there were 4 of them counting. By the next Thursday there were 9. And here is the cruelty of it. The thing that made grown men go quiet and stare at their own hands the way Emmett Pruitt had stared at his. It wasn't just that Voss stole. It was who he stole from. When the men laid their tickets side by side, a pattern came up out of the paper like a face coming up out of dark water. The big operators, the men with 300 acres and a hired crew and a cousin who ran trucks to Fargo, their tickets came up nearly true. Voss weighed them honest, or near enough that no man would ever catch it. Because those men had somewhere else to go. Those men could load a truck and haul 40 miles to another buyer, and Voss knew it. But the widow. The old man farming alone, the fellow with the bad note and the mortgage team, and no truck and no cousin. The ones who had to sell to Voss or watch their grain rot in the bin. Those were the tickets that came up short. Every time. He'd built it careful. He'd built it to steal from exactly the people who couldn't fight him and couldn't leave him. Cora Halvorsen wasn't singled out. Cora Halvorsen was just the newest name on a list 6 years long. Ivar Sund carried that news to her on a cold morning at the end of October, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, 22 years old, and looking like he'd aged a decade in a fortnight. He told her what the men were finding. He told her about Tollef's 3 tallies and the word Tollef said. And Cora stood on her own porch with Nils's coffee cup drying on the sill behind her. The cup she still set out from habit and still couldn't stop setting out, and she listened, and she didn't say anything for a long while. Then she said, "How many of them are counting now?" 9, maybe more by Sunday. "And how many are scared?" Ivar looked at his boots. "All 9. "Good," she said. "Scared men count careful. But she was scared too, and she didn't say that part, because there was a piece of it Ivar didn't know yet. She had a note at the Farmers and Merchants for $186.50, due the 1st of November. And it was near the end of October, and every bushel Voss had shorted her was a bushel she needed for that note. The stolen weight and the missing money were the same weight and the same money. She'd known it the night she drove to Kettle Junction. She knew it worse now, with the frost already whitening the fence wire in the mornings and the deadline coming on like a train. She could go to the bank and beg. Widows begged. The bank was used to it. She could sell the milk cow, sell a hog or two out of the 9 she had left, scrape and shave and maybe make the number by the skin of her teeth. Or she could make Harlan Voss give her back what he took. She looked at Ivar. Did the boy get to the sealer? Because that was the other thing. That was the piece that turned 9 scared men counting in their kitchens into something with teeth. Ivar had driven to the county seat the week before, on Cora's word, and he'd found the office of the new county sealer of weights and measures, a woman named Adele Thorne, appointed that spring when the old sealer died. Half the county had grumbled about a woman in the post. Half the county was about to be very glad of her. Miss Thorne was maybe 40, spare and plain and precise as a rule laid on a board, and when Ivar had stumbled through his story, the widow, the beam, the certified rail ticket at Kettle Junction, the tickets in the coffee cans, she had listened without one word of comfort or one word of doubt. She'd just listened. And then she'd asked to see a ticket. Ivar had brought Tolif Bright's. She'd looked at it a long time. Then she'd opened a great flat book on her desk and run her finger down a column and stopped. Voss's elevator, she'd said. Last sealed and tested 19 and 27. 6 years ago. She'd looked up. By law, that beam should be tested every year. Every commercial scale in this county that buys or sells by weight carries the county seal. And that seal means the beam was proven true against certified test weights inside the 12-month. His is 6 years stale. Is that? Can you do something about that? I can do a great deal about that, Adele Thorne had said, and closed the book. Any patron of that scale may demand a certified reweigh on the spot. Any citizen of this county may summon the sealer to test a commercial beam. I am obliged by the statute to come. And if I test that beam against my class weights and it reads false, she had set her flat hand on the closed book. Then it is not a broken scale, young man. A scale that reads light for 6 years and pays the operator the difference is not broken. It is a machine built to commit fraud. I can condemn it. I can pull the seal. And a condemned scale cannot lawfully buy 1 bushel of anyone's wheat. Ivar had stood there in her office with his heart going like a threshing engine. But, she'd said, and lifted one finger, hearsay tests nothing. I test iron against iron before witnesses, or I test nothing. If you want that beam proven, you bring me the beam and you bring me the witnesses, and you bring them in daylight where no man can say afterward it was done in a corner. You understand? I'll not have this be one widow's word against one buyer's word. I've seen how that ends. Bring me a crowd, and bring me weights I can certify, and I'll bring the law and the test set, and we'll read that beam out loud in front of God and everybody. That was what Ivar carried back. And that was the thing that turned it. Because now it wasn't 9 men counting alone in 9 cold kitchens. Now there was a shape to it. Now there was a day to point at. They met at the Grange Hall the next Thursday, and this time the room was full. 30-odd men, and a good few of their wives, in from the whole township, and the white board walls hung with lanterns and the wood stove ticking in the corner. Emmett Pruitt stood up at the front, Emmett who had spent his whole cautious life not provoking the only buyer in the county. And you could see it cost him something to stand. I've been Grange master here 11 years, Emmett said, and in 11 years I have counseled patients more times than I can count. I have said, let's not stir it up. I have said, Voss is all we've got, don't bite the hand. I said it because I was afraid, and I'll say that plain. Because I think a lot of us were afraid together and called it being sensible. Nobody moved. Well, I did what she asked, Emmett said, and everyone knew who she was. I went home, and I counted. And I'm ashamed of the number. Not because it's small. Because it isn't. He held up a fistful of tickets, 6 years, and I never once looked, because looking meant knowing, and knowing meant I'd have to do something, and doing something meant crossing the man who buys my wheat. So I chose not to know. That's the truth of it. He didn't just steal from me, he counted on my being too scared to check. And I was. For 6 years I was exactly the coward he needed me to be. An old man's voice cracked from the back. "You're not the only one, Emmett, no," Emmett said. "That's the point. That's exactly the point. There's not a one of us he could have robbed if we'd stood together the first year. He robbed us one at a time because we let ourselves be one at a time. And then they got to work. And the work was paper. They built a ledger. One big account book Toluf bought new at the mercantile, and every man who'd counted came up to the front and read his numbers. And a schoolteacher's daughter named Ruth wrote them down in a fair, clean hand. Household by household, load by load, year by year, back 6 years to when the beam was last tested honest. It took 3 Thursdays to build. Men kept finding more tickets. A fellow found 2 years' worth in a cigar box in the barn. A widow, because Cora was not the only widow. That was the thing that stopped the room cold when they understood it. There were 3 widows on that ledger before they were done. A widow named Mrs. Halloran brought tickets her husband had saved, and she'd never thrown out, and when they added her column, she put her hand over her mouth and had to sit down. And every night while they built it, 12 miles off, Harlan Voss slept fine. Not quite fine. Because Voss was no fool, and a man who steals develops an ear for trouble the way a dog develops an ear for the wagon coming home. He heard there'd been meetings. He heard the Grange hall lit up 3 Thursdays running. He didn't know what they had. But he could smell it, the way you smell weather coming, a change in the pressure of the county. So one Saturday, with a yard full of wagons and men in earshot, he made his move the only way he knew how. From behind his counter, loud so it carried, "I hear there's been some talk. Meetings and such." He let it sit. "Now I'm a reasonable man. But I'll tell you all something for nothing. I keep a book. And in that book is the name of every man I buy from and every man I extend a little credit to when his note comes due and he's short. And I've been thinking lately about how a man's got to be careful who he does business with. Troublemakers." He smiled. And it wasn't a smile. A man stirs up trouble against the fellow who buys his grain. Well, maybe that fellow decides he's full up. Maybe that fellow's book is closed to him. And then where does a troublemaker haul his wheat? 40 miles? On what road, with what team, before the frost? It was a good threat. It was the best threat he had, and it had worked for 6 years. Because it was true. He was the only buyer. He could ruin any one of them with a closed book. And it near worked again. Emmett told Cora after that half the room wavered that Saturday. Went pale and quiet and started thinking about their notes and their teams and the 40 miles in the frost. 2 men came to Emmett private and said maybe they ought to let it lie. Maybe it wasn't worth the farm. That was the near thing. That was the night it almost died. But Cora was there. And Cora stood up in the Grange hall that week, and she didn't holler and she didn't plead. She just laid it out flat, in that dry, steady voice, the voice of a woman who'd buried a husband 6 weeks back and driven 22 miles in the dark and stopped being afraid of small men somewhere on that road. "He says he'll close his book," she said. "To troublemakers. Well, let's think on what that means." She looked around the room. "It means he needs us. You understand? A man who threatens to stop buying your wheat is a man who is afraid of what happens if you stop selling it to him. He's not the only one who can close a book. There's 30 of us in this room and there's one of him. He can't ruin 30 men at once. He hasn't got the money to sit on an empty elevator through a winter with no farmers hauling in. He closes his book to all of us. He closes his own doors." She let that turn over in the room. "He's been telling us for 6 years we've got nowhere else to go. And we believed him, because each of us was standing alone, and each of us did have nowhere else to go. But 30 men together can build their own elevator. 30 men together can be the somewhere else. He's not big. He just made sure we always felt small. And an old farmer said, "Slow, by God, she's right." And another said it. And the room, which had near come apart that Saturday, came back together, tighter than before. Because now they weren't just angry. Now they weren't afraid. Or they were afraid and doing it anyway, which is the only kind of brave there ever is. They set the day. Public buying day. The first Saturday everybody hauled, when the yard would be full and the witnesses many. Adele Thorne would come with the state's certified test set, the sealed class weights, and the authority of her office. And the Grange would come with its ledger and its 30 families and every certified weight they could borrow county-wide. Weights from other elevators, from the creamery, from the rail office. Honest iron gathered from every honest scale in the county and brought to bear on one dishonest one. And Cora asked one thing. One thing. Quiet. At the end of that last meeting, when the sealer tests his beam, she said, "Let the first weight down on the pan be my Nils's." Nobody argued. Every man there knew about Nils Halvorsen. Knew he'd kept his own sealed brass pound weight on the mantel, stamped 1921 by the state, and checked Voss honest once a year for 30 years. And that Voss had hated him for it, and had waited. This was the part that made a man's jaw go tight. Had waited until Nils was 6 weeks in the ground before he set that poise light. He'd waited for the one man who checked to die. Let Nils's weight go down first, Cora said. He checked that beam 30 years. He can check it one more time. The night before, Harlan Voss oiled his beam. He felt the weather coming now, felt it plain, and like any man who's cheated a long time, he told himself the machine would hold, the story would hold. His word against theirs would hold like it always had. He wiped the knife edges clean and set the poise where he liked it, and he told himself a widow's arithmetic doesn't move a beam. He was about to learn what 30 families' arithmetic does. Saturday came up cold and bright, hard blue sky, frost burned off by 9. And Voss stood in his elevator door with his coffee and watched the road. And instead of the 11 wagons of an ordinary buying day, he watched 30 come over the rise. 30 wagons, and more, strung out along the section line, and walking beside them and riding in them the men and the women of the whole township, and a plain black county car at the front of it all with Adele Thorne sitting straight as a fence post inside. They filled his yard. They filled it and overflowed it. And they were quiet. That was the thing that unnerved him, Emmett said after. They weren't a mob. They didn't holler. They just came on and filled the yard and stopped, and stood and waited. 30 families deep and dead silent in the cold, looking at him. Adele Thorne got out of the car with a wooden case in each hand, and Ivar Sund carrying a third behind her. "Mr. Voss," she said. "I'm the county sealer. I'm here to test your beam." Voss set his coffee down. He'd had 6 years to get sure of himself, and it didn't leave him all at once. "This is my elevator," he said. "My scale. You're on my property, and I don't recall inviting the county onto it." "You don't need to invite me," Adele Thorne said. And she said it flat and easy, like a woman reading off a seed catalog. "I'd like you to hear the statute so there's no confusion later, in front of these folks who are witnesses to it." She didn't even open a book. She had it by heart. Every scale in this county used in the buying or selling of goods by weight is a commercial scale. And a commercial scale is subject to the sealer of weights and measures. I may test any such beam, on demand, on any day, and the operator may not refuse. Your seal is dated 19 and 27. You are 5 years past your lawful test. I am not asking your leave, Mr. Voss. I am telling you what is about to happen, as a courtesy. The yard was so quiet you could hear the elevator creak in the cold. "Now," she said, "you can stand aside and let me test it. Or you can obstruct a county officer in the discharge of her duty in front of 30 witnesses, and we can add that to the day's business. Which will it be?" And Harlan Voss, who had never in 6 years been made to stand and take it, stood there and took it. Because there was nothing else to do. Because the law was a woman with a wooden case and 30 families at her back. And his story only ever worked one farmer at a time. He stood aside. Adele Thorne walked up onto the scale platform, the same platform where Cora had been shamed, the same beam, the same poise, and she set her cases down and she opened them. And inside, nested in green felt, sat the certified class weights, each one stamped and sealed by the state. Honest iron proven true against the national standard. But she didn't reach for them first. "I understand," she said, and looked out over the yard, "that the first weight down is to be a particular one." And Cora Halvorsen came up out of the crowd. She climbed the 2 steps to the platform in her black coat, with the 3 tickets still folded in the pocket over her heart. And in her hand she carried the small brass pound weight, state-sealed, stamped 1921, that had sat 30 years on the mantel of the Halvorsen front room, and 30 years before that in the hand of the only man who ever checked Harlan Voss honest. She set it on the pan. 1 pound. 1 honest, certified, sealed pound of brass that a dead man had kept true for 30 years. And the beam, which should have balanced that pound dead level at the 1 pound mark, did not. It read light. Cora reached out and moved the poise the smallest touch to bring it level, and the whole yard watched the distance she had to move it. Not far. Just far enough. Just exactly the width of 6 years of theft made visible, in daylight, on the pan for anyone with eyes. Adele Thorne looked at it a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "Let's do it proper." And she loaded the certified stack. 100 pounds of state-sealed iron, weight by weight, each one called out as it went on. 25, 50, 75, 100. 100 pounds of certified truth on the pan of Harlan Voss's beam. And she read the beam. 96, she said. She said it loud, so the back of the yard heard it. 100 pounds of certified weight. This beam reads 96. She looked up, and for the first time something moved in that flat plain face. Something cold. 4 pounds short. To the 100. Every 100. She let the number walk out across the silent yard. A man hauls in 2,000 pound of wheat. This beam calls it 1,920. It has been eating 80 pounds out of every ton, from every man who couldn't argue, for 6 years. Somewhere in the crowd a woman started to cry. "Quiet," Voss said. "The beam's off a little." "Scales drift. That doesn't make it." "Scales drift both ways, Mr. Voss," Adele Thorne said. And now the cold in her voice had an edge you could shave with. "A scale that drifts honest reads heavy half the time and light half the time, and over 6 years it comes out near even, and the man loses nothing. Your beam has read light. Only light. For 6 years. Every single time. In your favor. Every time." She looked at him. "That is not drift. Drift doesn't pick a direction and hold it 6 years. That is a poise set by a hand. A scale doesn't decide on its own to rob the widow and pay the big man true. Somebody built that in. And you're the only hand that touches this beam." She took a stick of blue chalk out of her coat pocket. And on the iron housing of the beam, in big square letters that the whole yard could read, she wrote "Condemned." Then she reached down and she pulled the county seal, broke it clean off, and held it up so they could all see the broken wire. "This scale is condemned," she said to the yard, in the voice of the state of North Dakota. "It cannot lawfully buy or sell 1 bushel of grain until it is repaired, tested, and resealed by this office. As of this minute, Harlan Voss cannot buy your wheat. Not because you all decided it. Because the law says a thief's scale is shut." And into the ringing silence that followed, Cora Halvorsen spoke. She didn't shout. She never once that whole day raised her voice. She just looked at Harlan Voss across the platform where he'd told her to haul her grain home and feed it to the crows, and she said, dry and even and quiet enough that men leaned in to hear it, The scale kept your secret 6 years. Mr. Voss, a single certified weight, still sat on the pan behind her, catching the light. It couldn't keep it from 600 pounds of honest iron. Voss didn't answer. There wasn't an answer. He stood on his own platform in his own yard with condemned chalked on his beam and the broken seal in the sealer's hand, and 30 families watching him be exactly the small man he'd always been under the arrogance. And he had nothing. Then Emmett Pruitt came up the steps with the ledger. The big new account book, 3 Thursdays in the building, 30-odd households of counted losses in Ruth's fair clean hand. And Emmett opened it on the head of a wheat barrel there on the platform, and he read it out, household by household, out loud, in front of everyone. Tolef Bright, 6 years, 210 bushels short weight. At the prices paid, $61.40. Halloran, widow of 4 years, on her husband's tickets and her own. 88 bushels. $29 even. Emmett Pruitt, that's me. I'll read my own shame same as the rest. 6 years. 190 bushels. $55 and change. On and on. Every name. Every family got its number read into the cold air where Voss had to stand and hear it. Some of the numbers were small and some were terrible, and the small ones were almost worse, because you could see on a man's face what $30 was to him in the year 1933, with wheat at 41 cents a bushel and the drought thinning every field. And when Emmett got to the last name, he read it plain. Cora Halvorsen, widow of Nils. 3 loads this fall as a widow before she caught him. $186.50 short of what her wheat honestly weighed. Emmett looked up and looked at Cora, and his voice caught. Which is, to the penny, the note the banks got on her farm. Due the 1st of November. He very near took her whole place, folks, off 3 loads. Because he figured a new widow wouldn't check. And then Emmett closed the book and looked at Voss and said the total. The whole 6-year total, every household summed. I won't give you the figure because the figure isn't the point. The point is, it was a number no man could wave off as drift. A number with 30 families' names behind it and Harlan Voss's own signature on every ticket that proved it. His own hand. His own beam. His own 6 years. The state's been sent for, Emmett said. Miss Thorne's filed her condemnation, and there'll be charges, fraud, and short weight, and operating past seal. Your buyer's license is suspended today, this minute, pending you make every family on this ledger whole, every dollar, or you don't buy again in this county. Ever, Harlan Voss looked out at 30 families, and for the first time in 6 years, he understood that he had lost. Not a scale, not a season, the whole thing. The arithmetic he'd slept so fine on had come home in wagons and stood in his yard and read itself out loud. He didn't rage. Small men rarely do at the end. The rage is for when they're winning. He just got gray in the face and went inside and shut the door. And the 30 families hitched up their honest wagons and hauled their wheat home unsold. Because there was no lawful buyer in the county that day. And not a one of them minded. They'd rather haul it home true than sell it short. That was the whole thing, right there in the hauling home. Now, you'd think that was the end of it. Beam condemned, thief exposed, the widow's number read out to the penny. But there was one more scene the county had to play, and it came to the Grange Hall of all places, and it came on Harlan Voss's own 2 feet. Because a condemned scale can't buy wheat. And an elevator that can't buy wheat is just a tall empty building eating its own mortgage. Voss had a note too, it turned out. Voss was mortgaged same as the rest of them. And with his beam shut and the harvest coming in, he had about 3 weeks before he was as ruined as he'd tried to ruin Cora Halvorsen. So he came to the Grange. Hat in hand, which nobody had ever seen. He stood at the front of that white board hall where Cora had laid down her 3 papers, and he asked the men he'd robbed, to please sell him their wheat anyway. to let him fix the beam and buy their grain and keep his doors open. For the good of the county, he said. Because where else would they haul, come winter, if the elevator closed? And the Grange heard him out, calm all the way through. They'd learned that from Cora, too, the not hollering. Then Emmett Pruitt named the price. You'll pay the ledger first, Emmett said. Every dollar. Before you buy one more bushel. Then you'll put in a new certified beam and let Miss Thorne test it and seal it. And then, this is the part you'll like least, Harlan, you'll submit to a public test. Every month, first Saturday, the sealer or her deputy or a committee of this Grange weighs certified iron on your beam in front of anybody who wants to watch, and the figures get posted on your own elevator door for the whole county to read. Every month. From now on. Emmett let that sit. Or, he said, you don't have to agree to any of it. You're a free man. And in that case, 30 families in this room build our own elevator on the section line. A co-op, one man, one vote. An honest beam we own together. And you can sit in your tall, empty building and buy nothing from nobody till the bank takes it. Your choice entirely. We'd just as soon build the co-op. Truth is, some of us hope you say no. Harlan Voss stood there a long moment. And then he signed. Because there was nothing else to do, same as there'd been nothing else to do when Adele Thorne climbed his platform. He signed the restitution, and he signed the terms, and as he set the pen down he said the one thing he had left to say. The thing men like him always say. Quiet, half to himself, like it explained anything. A man's got to make his margin, and not one soul in that room answered him. Not a word. They just looked at him, 30 families he'd fed on for 6 years, and let the silence be the answer, and it was a worse answer than any shouting could have been. He picked up his hat, and he went out, and the door shut behind him, and Tolif Bright said, to nobody, the way he'd started the whole thing, well, just that. Well, and it was done. Now let me tell you how it looked a year on. Because that's the part that matters, in the end. Anybody can lose. The question is what grows back. October again. 1934, wheat still cheap and the drought not done, times still hard as a fence post. This isn't the kind of story where money rains from the sky. Because that kind of story is a lie and you've all lived long enough to know it. Times stayed hard. But different hard. Honest hard. On the section line, where 2 roads cross about halfway between the Halvorsen quarter and the town, stood a new elevator. Not tall and not fancy. Raised by 30 families with their own hands and their own borrowed money, board by board, the summer passed. The Ostrander Farmers Co-op. One man, one vote. And on the buying platform stood a new scale with a beam tested and sealed by Adele Thorne herself, and posted on the door every first Saturday, the certified test figures, for anybody to read. And bolted to the wall beside that honest beam, in a little glass box a carpenter had made special, sat a small brass pound weight, state sealed. Stamped 1921, Nils Halvorsen's weight, the one he'd kept true 30 years. The reference weight for the whole co-op now, the first thing any new beam got checked against, the standard was held to. So that a man who'd checked one crooked scale honest for 30 years and got hated for it and died 6 weeks before he could catch the theft he'd spent his life guarding against. That man's honest pound of brass now kept a whole county true. There's a kind of justice in that you don't get to plan. It just comes, if you're stubborn enough and you live long enough. Or your weight does. Cora Halvorsen made her note. The $186.50 paid to the farmers and merchants by the 1st of November, out of grain weighed honest at last. She kept the 160 acres. She kept the 9 hogs and the milk cow. She kept the farm Nils built. And the bank stamped the note paid. And she brought that stamped paper home and put it on the mantel where the brass weight used to sit. In the empty square in the dust, and it fit the space just about right. She still sets his coffee cup out some mornings. Habit's a long thing. But she told Ivar Sund once, Ivar, who farms the next quarter now and drives her to town and calls her ma'am, she told him it had stopped being a sad thing and started being a good morning thing. Which is about all any of us can ask of the ones we've lost. That the setting out of the cup turns, someday, from a wound into a hello. And Harlan Voss? He's still there, 12 miles off, paid the ledger, every dollar, took him most of a year and about broke him. But he paid it. New beam, sealed, public test the first Saturday of every month, his figures posted on his own door for the county to read. He buys a little wheat still, from the few who'll sell to him, and every load he buys goes across an honest beam now. And every honest load reminds him what he can no longer take. That's his sentence, not prison. Something worse for a man like that. He weighs his own dwindling loads on a scale that finally tells the truth, and the truth is, he's a small man in a tall, empty building, and everyone knows it, and the beam won't lie for him anymore. A scale only reads what it's built to read. That's the whole of it. Build it to steal, it'll steal, quiet, for years, from exactly the people who can't fight back. But build it honest, or better, build your own, together, and hold it to a dead man's brass, and it'll tell the truth to everybody the same. That's what a county figured out, one coffee can at a time. Because one widow drove 22 miles in the dark and refused to sign her name to a lie. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, I told you at the start this story was for you. Now you know how it weighs out. Comment the town you're farming or watching from. I'd like to know how far this one carried.